Hi, everyone. It's Nina Collins and Sherry Brennan from the Wolfer, and we're here because we've been doing this 10-day workshop in the community called Do the Work, Unlearning Racism. It's a workshop created by a woman named Rachel Cargill, and it was actually someone in our community, Karen Rappaport, who suggested to us about 3 weeks ago that we consider doing the 30-day program in the community. And Sherry and I said, that's a great idea, let's do it. And we started about 2 weeks ago. If you Google Rachel Cargill, you can find information. Do the Work, Unlearning Racism. She's an activist. She's young. She's around 30. Very, very smart. And she's created this 30-day program that you can follow. So every day there's some homework. And then we meet at noon on the Wolfer platform. And there have been consistently about 25 to 30 women, really no fewer than 25 on any day. So really the same women showing up day after day, and the work is intense. Like the homework, you really need to think, and then we sit around for an hour and kind of parse it, talk it through, and it's not meant to be easy. So I've been very impressed actually with our community and with Sherry who's been running it with me. It's really been great. So Sherry and I are going to go through, I'm going to talk about the program goals briefly, and then we're going to kind of alternate day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, and just describe what we've been doing. We're doing this right now because we're in a 5-day break. So we finished day 10 this past Monday, and we're going to start up again on day 11 this coming Saturday at noon.
Eastern. Don't forget those of us on the West Coast.
Thank you. Sorry, you're right. Noon Eastern, 9 a.m. West Coast. And we'll continue. And we've really taken an extra effort to constantly say to people, you're welcome to drop in anytime. Don't feel like because you've missed day 1 through 10, you can't come in. Really, every day stands alone as a lesson. And we don't want people to feel bad if they can't commit to 30 days. We think any bit of this that you do will be helpful. And we really welcome a wide range of voices. So the program goal is generally to help participants understand what it's like to be Black in America, to talk about systemic racism, individual acts versus systems of oppression, the interconnections between laws and common practices, classrooms, healthcare, social safety net, trust, societal behavioral expectations, et cetera. And then to really identify what you can do to help change happen, like how to talk with racist friends, family members, how to speak up when you see something occurring that you know is wrong. The question of ally versus accomplice. It's not easy, but it's really worth the effort. So I'm going to turn it over to Sherry to describe day 1.
Thank you. That was a good overview. Didn't mean to leave out people in the middle of the country either. So we really do want everybody to join. 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m. or noon, whatever time zone you're in, around the world too, if it suits your schedule. So
yeah, and to address, because people have complained a little bit that the time doesn't work, and we totally get it, and we're sorry. We knew that we could not find a time that would work for everyone, and we can't do it multiple times a day. So we considered changing the time and then decided not to. This seems to be kind of the most straightforward, noon, 9 a.m. So we hope you can come.
And we're sorry if you can't. There's also a thread in the group where we can have the conversations in writing. And there's a lot of information already there. I think there's 250 or so posts. So people are talking about these issues there. And it's a great place to discuss some of the same things. I would say if you're going to tune in to day 11 and you haven't been part of it yet, you should probably at least do days 1, 2, and 3. That will give you sort of an orientation. Just do them on your own so that you get a feel for the kinds of things we've been reading and watching.
One other thing to add before I interrupt you is also the women who've been doing it have been so good, and they've been writing in suggestions, so additional materials and ideas and movies and books and articles. So Sherry compiled a 6-page document, which Sydney has then turned into a blog post, which we're publishing today. So it's true, if you want to join late, it might be a good idea to at least watch this video and maybe look at that document and just do some of the homework on your own to kind of catch up in little bits at least.
Yes. So day 1 was really sort of more of an orientation day. And we had to watch a short video. I think it was 4 minutes long, with a woman who was very sort of chirpy and positive about what she was talking about, just to get us started. And it was called 5 Tips for Being an Ally. And the 5 tips were pretty obvious, really, when you think about it, but good to, start simple and build from there. So the first one was understand your privilege. That's a word that a lot of people react negatively to, thinking, I have all these issues in my life, and I'm not privileged, when they're really talking about a specific form of privilege that accrues to people based on their skin color, not being brown or black. So that's the first lesson, is to understand that. The second is to listen and do your homework. The third is related to that: speak up, but not over. So learning how to talk about these things and how to speak up on behalf of people, or to say things when you see bad things happening, to say something, but not to speak over the people who are actually being affected, and to make sure to sort of read your room, know your audience, and respect other people who are actually in the situations, experiencing racism perhaps, to really not talk over them as if you know more about it than they do, because you don't. You're not them. You can't. Um, Another really important lesson that we all need to keep in mind and learn and inhabit fully is the knowledge that we are going to make mistakes as we do this work and as we try to get less racist in our behaviors. We're going to make mistakes, and when we do, it's very important to acknowledge them and to verbalize it with whomever we've hurt or offended. So you're going to make mistakes. That's okay. It's part of the process, but you do have to apologize when you make them. And then the last one is ally is a verb. In other words, this is not an intellectual exercise. This is about changing behavior and doing things differently and changing our society. That's the journey we're embarked upon.
Nice. So day 2 was called Get Over Yourself, an introduction to the concept of white fragility. We read as the homework an article called White Fragility: Why It's So Hard to Talk to White People About Racism. But we also hugely, hugely recommend, if you haven't already seen it, the Robin DiAngelo video. If you Google Robin DiAngelo in YouTube, the first thing you'll get is a lecture she gave. She's the author of White Fragility, and a lecture she gave at the Seattle Public Library. I think everyone in our community has now, not everyone in our community, but everyone in this group has watched it. It's a fantastic video. So white fragility, if you're not completely familiar with the concept, is the term used to describe the limited tolerance white people have for the discomfort they experience when discussing matters of race-based discrimination and inequality. We've all experienced discomfort talking about race, and the natural inclination is to turn away to avoid discomfort. But in order to build the muscle, we have to use it. So we have to practice, which is what we're doing here in this group, and we need to do it out in the world as well. We'll all make mistakes, as Sherry said, see day 1, and we have to be humble and self-aware and apologize, acknowledge when we do. We talked about the need to avoid white savior behaviors. We talked a little bit, certain issues have come up almost every day, issues around performative behavior, issues around confessional behavior. So we talked about all of that and recalled the admonition from day 1 to speak up, but not over.
Great. Yeah, that was probably the first hard day, although there were more hard days to come, as we'll see. Day 3 was called Never Forget, and it was something of a history lesson in which we watched a couple of different videos. There was one given in the homework, and then another one that we found and posted. The BBC documentary about racism and the history of African slavery around the world was really quite interesting and eye-opening, even though it's a subject we all think we know enough about. I think one of the things I took away from day 3 was I don't actually know enough about it. I don't know enough about the history. There are events like the massacre in Tulsa, for example, that many people didn't know about until recently. That kind of an event, not even taught in local history. If you grow up in Tulsa, you may well not even know about that if you're not Black. Even if you are Black, if your parents moved there after that or something, and you might not have ever learned about it. So that was very, very interesting and saddening, honestly. We also learned another thing I didn't know, which was that there were Black people who came to America before slavery who were, of course, free because slavery hadn't come here yet, owned property, started businesses. They came here for the exact same reasons as the white settlers came. And, maybe 40 years later, had their property seized, and in many cases they were enslaved, or their children or grandchildren were enslaved. So another chapter of our history that we really just don't learn about in school. I could go on and on, but I won't. We did talk a little bit. Yeah, we got to stop at some point. We did also talk a little bit about the fact that trauma is imprinted in DNA and can be passed generationally, and that has a lasting impact, and is among the reasons why simply freeing enslaved people and walking away doesn't solve the whole problem. So those were some of the lessons we learned in our history day.
Yeah, one of the things that also came up that was great, because we have a wide range of women coming from different experiences in the conversation. So there were a few women who grew up in the South and talked kind of painfully about the fact that they didn't get this education at all growing up. I mean, and it wasn't just the South, certainly it's all over. We all have not gotten as much education on these subjects as we need to. But it was interesting to have some people speak up feeling that not only did they not get some education, but they actually got, were really lied to. And that was kind of, I think, powerful for people to recognize and be able to talk about. Day 4 was called What Lies Beneath, an exploration of unconscious bias in all of us. So we did 2 things. We watched the infamous video, The Doll Test, in which Black and brown children almost uniformly pick out other brown or Black dolls or pictures as bad. And then when they had to point to the brown or Black doll which looked most like them. It's a completely heartbreaking video if you haven't seen it. It's called The Doll Test. Many people in our group wondered if the questions were asked in such a way as to limit the chance of answering in a more healthy way. The consensus was that these kids are at a minimum repeating what they believe to be the right answers. And so therefore the manner of questioning was somewhat beside the point. We were all worried and hoped that these kids got counseling and support after being subjected to these kind of horrific tests. The other thing we did is many of us took many of the implicit bias tests from Harvard's Project Implicit. You can take tests about fat and thin, light skin, dark skin, black, white, and we got a feel for our own instinctive biases. And this caused many of us quite a bit of shame. Most of us were quite surprised by the results of our test. But we also discussed the fact that the idea is not to come up with some sort of neutral score, but rather to see that we all have instinctive subconscious biases, and therefore we have to become more conscious of the ways of our words and our actions, so that we can live, our lives in accordance with the value of what we think it should be of racial equality. We have to get quiet in ourselves was kind of the idea, and think about ways we can each become more vocal and courageous in seeking to use privilege to become better allies. So I'm trying to think what else happened that day. That was the day we started really having some of the confessional aspect come up, because we asked people to share ways in which implicit bias may show up in their lives and experiences they've had. So it was generally, I'd say the group is not hugely confessional. We are really kind of learning and talking through things, but we have tried to create some space for people to feel like it's a safe space to be honest, because we feel like one of the principles of the Wolfer in general is that, you can kind of get through shame by recognizing you're not alone, by really recognizing everyone's truth, which is that this is hard stuff and we don't talk about it enough.
Right. And that's also goes to building that muscle of being able to tolerate uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah.
Obviously, we learn best when we're able to feel safe. And so that's an important aspect.
Yeah, absolutely.
So day 5, that was called Examining Privilege. And it was really a deeper dive into the notion of what it means to have privilege, what kinds of privilege there are. We read an article called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, which was quite a great metaphor, I think, for the fact that we all carry around different identities, including our skin color, which give us privilege or reduce our privilege. So you might get privilege by belonging to a religion that is considered normal in this culture, or you might lose it by being, say, a Muslim, where that religion has had a lot of, public, I don't know even what to call it, just strife or, a lot of fingers pointed at Muslim people after 9/11 in particular. We talked about the fact that if you're cisgendered, that gives you privilege versus if you're not, or if you are heterosexual versus homosexual. They're just a privilege is conferred on you just based on pieces of your identity that you can't or don't choose, that are just part of who you are. And so being really aware of that and what privilege you have, and ways that you are privileged. So think about the fact that if you are white and you walk into a store, you're not usually followed around by the clerk who thinks you might be about to steal something. Whereas if you are a young Black man, I think almost every Black person in America would probably report having at some point or another felt that they were being watched suspiciously somewhere. That typically does not happen to white people. So that's just a really visceral example. We also talked about in that day, um, Black people in stores being asked for ID when they use a credit card, even though the white person in front of them in line wasn't.
Mhm.
And we talked about what we should do. And I said, I felt uncomfortable mentioning it because I didn't want to further embarrass the Black person by saying, hey, that's not right. You didn't ask that white person for her ID. Why are you asking this Black woman for the ID? And all the Black women who were on the call went, oh no, please speak up.
Speak up. It was a great moment. Yeah. It's been very helpful. We've had a mix. We've had more white women than not in the group calls, but we have had a number of mixed women and Black women, and it's been really, really helpful getting the different kinds of responses.
Yeah, it has. The other thing we talked about that day was sort of the myth of meritocracy that we are all taught, that America is a place where if you just work hard enough and are honest and truthful, you can get ahead. We were also taught in school that racism was a thing of the past and we were all equal now, so we don't need to worry about it anymore. Since nobody in 2020 owns slaves, we aren't guilty. And that all of that is somewhat of a lie because the effects of racism and slavery persist in our society. And so we need to look at the notion of meritocracy and what that has actually meant for different kinds of people in our country and how we can work towards getting to a place where that is actually true. That's the goal. That's what we all want.
Yeah. Day 6, after 5 days that were quite intense, day 6 was a fun day. It was called Clean House, a breath of culture and joy. So the task on day 6 was to take stock of the number of Black voices we surround ourselves with in our media choices and to increase them. We all talked about lists of books, movies, TV shows, social media sites. We provided lists of all these things, and then we encouraged everyone to talk about what they have in their lives and to identify a few things that they wanted to add to their lives. So we published lists. We've been publishing lots of these at the Wolfer. We have Black books, Black video. I mean, like everyone right now is publishing a million videos, but and lists, we've done the same thing and we'll continue to add to them. So day 6 was a fun day and it was a little bit of a break.
However, day 7, we got back to being challenged. And I would say day 7 was probably one of the more challenging days because the title of the article we read, so the day was called Coming to Terms. And, that's sort of like the foreboding music in a horror film. And the article that we read was called The Most Dangerous Person in America is the White Woman. So of course that makes you uncomfortable if you're white, right? To be thought of as dangerous. And they make the point that white people, as I think I heard on a radio program the next day, that white people use the police as their personal race valet. So white people, as we saw in the Amy Cooper, Christian Cooper exchange in New York a few weeks ago, this white woman felt totally comfortable calling the police and telling them that a Black man was threatening her life when he asked her politely to leash her dog. So that was a really good example, very timely, of a white woman being very, very dangerous to a Black man, because if the cops had been there and shot him, that would have been her fault, right? So that makes her dangerous. And there are many, many examples as we look back in history of this kind of thing actually happening. So we tried to reframe this in the discussion we had that day around the idea that dangerous means powerful, and that also means because we are safe or safer than Black people with groups like the police, we have power and we can use our voices and our bodies to speak up and to protect people. And so that's the way that we tried to reframe the notion that we are dangerous, but that also means that we can be powerful agents of change.
We also talked that day about the relationship between white women and Black women, and we found a really good podcast whose name I'm not going to remember right now. I should have had it at the tip of my tongue. But we talked about it's in one of our many lists, but we talked about how this comes up a lot in the workplace. And we had a few helpful Black women who were willing to speak up and talk about this, because it's a very real reality. And we want to do more work on that, the relationship between white women and Black women, because there is a sense that white women can easily fall into victim mode, right? They'll start to cry. They'll start to say, I'm scared. If a Black woman is too strident or speaks to her angrily, what really comes up very subtly, or not so subtly to some people, is the race card. It's there all the time, and white women don't acknowledge it. And that's part of the idea that white women are dangerous. So that was a really good day and a tough day, and I think one that needs to be revisited. So after 7 days of talking about a lot of things that were kind of personal, like, privilege and bias, we were kind of relieved to move on day 8 to systemic racism, which can feel more overwhelming in a way, because it's harder. It's not always so easy to know what to do, but so important to understand. So we watched a short video filled with statistics about how pervasive the impacts of racism in America really are. Even though amazingly about half of white Americans don't believe that race is a significant issue. The video we watched argued that there's evidence all over the place, including that sentences for Black men are on average 20% longer than those for white men convicted of the same crime, that white and Black people use illegal drugs at approximately the same rate, but Black people are 3 times more likely to be convicted of a drug offense. Black kids are more likely than white kids to be tried as adults. When thousands of identical resumes were sent to companies around the country with only the name of the applicant changed, so the names were Emily, Brandon, Lakeisha, or Jamal, Lakeisha and Jamal got 50% fewer callbacks than Emily and Brandon. Only 74% of predominantly Black and Latino high schools offer Algebra 2 versus nearly all predominantly white high schools, which is really insane. Ditto at 66% for chemistry. And the life expectancy for Black people, 74.9 as of 2017, is about 3.5 years shorter at birth than that for whites, which is 78.5, nearly 5% shorter. Yeah, so there were lots and lots of things. This was kind of the beginning of systemic racism. So you'll see in the next few days after that, we start really digging into it, talking about medical issues and incarceration, education. So this was our first day of kind of saying, let's be real. There are lots and lots of facts that we can look at that show that racism is systemic, that it's pervasive, that it's, what everyone is saying in these last few weeks, particularly, that it is part of who we are as Americans, and we can't not look at it. So a little frustrating, because it's often hard to figure out what to do. It's a little overwhelming, but it was a really good conversation.
And it's also good to have a few facts in your pocket when you're asked by people for examples of racism. Because we've been talking a lot in the group about how to talk to people who are sort of racism deniers, or who say, I'm not guilty. I don't have any part of the problem. I'm not part of the problem. What do you say to them? How do you make the case that actually racism does exist in this country? And so some of these statistics are helpful.
Yeah, no, that's a really good. We should say that probably the biggest issue we've come upon in this group we've been running so far is people with that question. Like, how do I deal with people in my realm, friends or family, who are either overtly racist in private, or who think they're not racist but are? And how do you talk to those people? So this is something we keep bumping up against. So you're right, Sherry. It's having statistics is helpful.
Yeah. So day 9, we started to dive in on specific areas of our culture, society, where racism is pervasive and continuing. And the first one, which we covered on day 9, was racism in the medical or healthcare area. So we talked a lot about how in the past, we watched 2 videos, I should say. One of them was about some historic information about how Black people were used as test subjects by white doctors, both slaves who had no say in the matter of whether they could be used that way or not, and people who were also unwittingly treated in experimental ways, which harmed them. really some horrific examples that I don't think any of us were necessarily aware of. Unanesthetized surgeries in the 1800s on slaves who were strapped down. I mean, that is just, I can't even imagine. Um, One of the videos we watched was also an interview with Harriet Washington, who wrote a book called Medical Apartheid. And that talks much more about current practices or recent practices and gives a lot of data and examples of things happening in the medical world today that perpetuate racism. Things like people being on the list for kidney transplants. And if they're white, their file might be very, very thick and full of all kinds of praise for their families and the support they'll get, and sort of basically advocating for them to get a kidney. Whereas if they were Black, might say Negro all over the file and talk about how they're unlikely to participate in follow-up care. So things like that, which are just, there's no evidence that Black people participate less in their own follow-up care. Just like ridiculous. So unsubstantiated claims that give rise to some of the reasons for life expectancy to be shorter, because you're not getting as good of care and you're not getting as much sort of attention paid. Also, I think we've all read lately about the fatality rates or death rates in maternity situations, higher for Black women than white women, higher for Black babies than white babies by a significant and horrifying margin. So we talked about all these things. And like Nina said, for day 8, some of this stuff is a little overwhelming because you wonder, what the heck can any of us do to change this? So we really started to think about things like advocating for better training, advocating by going to doctors who supporting, basically putting our money where we think it will help, supporting doctors and practices who treat people equally and who don't, for example, refuse to take health insurance, or who dedicate a percentage of their practice to helping underserved populations, things like that. And also speaking up, maybe going as an advocate with a Black woman who's pregnant, who's a friend of yours, maybe just being there to advocate. And it made me remember being in the labor room with my friend who was Black when she was waiting for her husband to show up when their baby was being born, and just being there. I didn't think of it as a race thing at the time, but now looking back on it, hopefully maybe she got better care because I was there. So those are some concrete things that we can do as white people to try to help, as well as supporting systemic changes that would help everybody.
Great. So yeah, day 9, the medical day, I think some of us felt a little discouraged. It was kind of horrifying, but it's true, Sherry, we did come up with some ways we can help. And there was a lot in there that I don't think we really knew about. I'm not sure if you also mentioned the idea of Black people kind of distrusting the medical establishment
yes.
a little bit more, but because of the history. So that kind of factors in sometimes. So day 10 was about racism and housing, a look at how racism and bias have affected the housing market for Black Americans. We read 2 articles, one about historic redlining and the other about disparities that persist today. So for those of you who don't know, from the 1930s until the late 1960s, codified banking practices in American cities across the country outlined rules for lending or not lending based on the racial composition of neighborhoods, as well as the age of homes and whether or not less desirable populations were infiltrating. They kind of decided that certain areas were dangerous or less safe, and therefore less desirable for lending money. Many neighborhood associations had rules prohibiting white owners to sell to Black buyers. And in major cities, co-op boards had similar restrictions controlling who could move into the buildings. They still do, in fact, of course, in New York. While these practices were formally outlawed in 1968, many informal practices continue today. So a lot of people in our group raised the New York issue, which is true. We discussed a few other practices along these lines: outright property seizure through unethical means, like having a child sign a property deed over to the bank, and home purchases in gentrifying neighborhoods by, sleazy realtors who offer like well below market purchase prices to unsuspecting poor or elderly residents, which forces them out of their homes without a fair market price. We see this everywhere in gentrifying neighborhoods, right? we again discussed what can we do and came up with a few ideas. It was kind of heartening in this class, this lesson, because we had a few people in the group who are real estate brokers or who work for nonprofits that actually work in housing. So those people kind of came up with some concrete ways they can make differences and pay more attention. We also talked about kind of looser ideas like moving to mixed neighborhoods, using our voices on co-op boards and in neighborhood associations, places where we can advocate for diversity and anti-racist policies. We can speak up when we see racist acts. We can volunteer in our communities to work with kids of all races. We talked in that lesson, that class, about the idea of mentoring anti-racist behavior, perhaps to white kids. We want to maybe have a future class about the idea of mentoring in general, because the idea sometimes of white women mentoring Black young women is not bad, but can be problematic. And we were kind of just trying to tease this out a little bit. And then we were thinking, well, maybe it would be actually even better, or certainly also really good, for white women to be mentoring white kids and really, modeling and educating and showing them the kind of behavior and raising the kind of issues about systemic racism that most likely they are not being taught. So showing up for both kids, of color and white.
Right. That I think is a really interesting possibility. And you could see that playing out across the country in community groups all over the place
Yeah.
to help teach kids things they're not learning in school. I think it would be
Yeah.
great. So that was the first 10 days. As we expected, they were not always easy. Sometimes they were downright depressing and disheartening. I personally had several moments of being, of crying, just feeling so sad and just really inhabiting or letting it sink into me the depth of the destruction to Black people that has been wreaked by 250 years of slavery and another 150 years of unequal treatment, and just how wrong that is. I think we all need to really experience that and know it and own it, and not to wallow in it, not to be depressed and downhearted or to condemn ourselves, but to own how big the problem is, because it's not going to be a fast or simple solution. It's going to take a lot of different ideas and different people working together to come up with a million solutions to help solve this problem.
Well,
Yeah, sorry.
no, not at all. One moment that I found really moving was when Sherry called me, and she'd been crying because in one of the readings, the idea that for white people to keep out not just Black culture but all culture, right? The idea of like saying things are other and pushing them out or being afraid of them and not wanting them is really a deprivation. I mean, think of what you've lost by not welcoming in different cultures and ways of speaking, ways of thinking, ways of being in the world. That loss is super sad. And anyway, I thought that was very moving when Sherry had this kind of like, I hadn't thought of it in quite that way either, and I was moved by it. And I think the other thing that's really been interesting for me is this idea of thinking about our complicity, right? Whether overt or silent. It's such a necessary first step. So I think hearing people's stories and having people think through, like, how much are they standing up? I mean, I've had to really think about it myself in terms of colorism and being light skinned and the advantages I have for being light skinned and having hair that's, good or easy or whatever. So we're really learning a lot. It's been great to have 5 days off because it's been super intense, but I'm actually missing it and excited to go back. And I think day 11 is education, which is going to be really interesting. So we really want more people to join. If we really got a lot more people, we'd probably have to use breakout groups, whatever, we'll figure it out. We have a lot of women in there who are just as capable of facilitating as Sherry and I are. We have really excellent women who are doing a lot of work. So I think that's it, Sherry, right? Do we have anything else to add?
I think, did we want to talk about, well, first of all, we're starting again on Saturday, as Nina said. So please come to the group and find the link and join us. Do we want to talk about a watch party?
Oh, we are going to do a watch party on Monday. Hold on. We're doing a watch party for 13th. the movie, the Ava DuVernay movie, on Monday night, June 22nd. And there'll be a link to sign up for that on the
Can
website.
I voice of God over this speech? Hi, I'm Sydney. I handle the tech. And I think what's going to happen if you want to join our watch party is that you should all download the Google Chrome extension. You can get it on a Mac or PC. And then Nina will post her watch party link at the time that we'll, share ahead of time. And you'll all just click to join with us.
Yeah, no, that's going to be really fun. And hopefully we'll do more of those. So yeah, next steps. Let's see. We're starting Saturday, June 20th. We're going to do another 10-day section using the same Zoom link we've been using. So if you go into the community, you can go to the events icon on the website page, and you'll see all of our events, including this one, Unlearning Racism, Do the Work. If you're in the community, if you're a VIP member, there's also a long thread in the community about this where people have been adding and writing to it and talking. All the information is listed in both places. You can also always just email us, info@thewolfer, Nina@thewolfer, Sydney@thewolfer.com. Classes are every day at 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern. We're doing the watch party next Monday. And if you don't know, it's about the 13th Amendment, which made slavery illegal, except in the case of criminals. So it's about the kind of loophole that really led to the kind of continuum of slavery incarceration. Sorry, how's the continuum go? I've forgotten the term.
Well, it just basically is the underpinning of what is now mass incarceration of Black men, and Black men being so much more likely than white men to have an encounter with jail.
I'm frankly afraid to watch this movie and feel super guilty about it. So I'm finally going to watch it on Monday.
I watched it, but I think I was traumatized, and so I'll watch it again with everyone. So that's it, I guess. I think we wanted to thank everybody who's been participating, and also the people who have watched this recap. We hope it's helpful. We certainly have gotten a lot out of it ourselves. I know I have. And
in particular, to thank Karen Rappaport for suggesting it. It was a great idea. We're super appreciative. All right. Thanks, everyone. That was good, Sherry. We did it in 37 minutes.